Thank you very much for setting a very good standard, finishing before your time. Could I invite William next on this?
Yes, thank you, Ashok. So to build on that and build on Ashok's introduction, it seemed like a useful complement and leading into what Richard will share, to say a few words about economic levers in general and then give you an example from my own research in Ghana and in Mali earlier that I think illustrates the kinds of power that economic levers have. So, Archimedes said, give me a long enough lever and a place to stand, and I can move the world. Which begs the question of what's the place to stand? What's the fulcrum of this lever? And, you chose to come to the economics lever session. There are inclusion levers, governance levers, technology levers. What is it that economics levers are standing on? And it seems useful to me to think about standing on the entrepreneurial spirit, that sort of universal desire for a better life, for oneself, but often especially for one's children, that every mother, father, household shares, and that people in markets and farm activities share. And we can ask, as economists or as people interested in an economics approach, from their point of view, what are the constraints they face? What are the resource limitations and access and prices? And that leads to the instruments that Ashok described. It leads to the instruments that Olivier mentioned. But especially when you think about people interacting with each other, quite often one well-intentioned entrepreneurial person meeting another well-intentioned entrepreneurial person will find it very hard to shake hands and make a deal, either because there's some constraint in market structure, and we'll think about the institutions that will allow people to, for example, you drive on the left-hand side of the street, I'll drive on the right-hand side of the street. It's going to be different in India than in Europe, but as long as you stay on the right side and there's a traffic policeman at the intersection, traffic will move smoothly. If you take away the rule, take away the traffic policeman, so this is the traffic won't move. So this is the visible hand of the state that makes the private handshake possible. This is what we're thinking about as economists. So the example that I want to give that I think illustrates this long lever of economic, the visible hand of government that makes markets possible, concerns the problem of infant feeding. So I've done a lot of economics, and I have done a little bit of nutrition, and as a late convert to nutrition, I'm particularly fervent. And I only got to take one class in nutrition in graduate school, but I was very lucky to take it from Ray Martorell, who's a very prominent nutrition professor in the United States. And ever since then, what struck me as one particularly important issue is that after a period of exclusive breastfeeding, an infant needs, after about 6 months of age, food that is of greater nutrient density and digestibility than the family diet. Much greater nutrient density and digestibility. And that there are fundamentally two ways to obtain that greater nutrient density and digestibility. So this is not food that's present anywhere else in the family diet. Once you're more than 2 years of age, you don't need this high density and digestibility. One, you can do it yourself using an ancestral recipe. So that is typically a starchy staple, fortified by a source of protein and fats and micronutrients that might be some legumes, some vegetable matter, some vegetables, and some perhaps animal source foods, and a lot of processing. So what you see is fermentation, germination, grinding, roasting, processing of great intensity to produce a very small quantity of food for a 6-month, 8-month, 10-month, year-old infant. And that labor intensity is extremely costly. The alternative is you can buy the stuff, where an artisanal or industrial producer will do all that labor-intensive processing for you. And the problem there is you can't observe the nutrient density or digestibility that's in this complementary food. You cannot see it, you cannot taste it, you can't smell it. And when you feed it to the child, if it's not there, the child will fail to thrive, fall below their growth curve, below their growth potential. But lots of other things could have caused that, because at that time, the introduction of complementary foods after 6 months is also the first time they're getting water, So they're exposed to waterborne parasitic and infectious disease. It's the first time they're getting out of the house and interacting with children, so they're exposed to upper respiratory diseases, parasitic loads rise, and you see lots of other potential causes of failure to thrive. So you cannot observe, you the mother, no matter how much you're hoping for a better life for your child, cannot observe the nutrient density and digestibility. So what do we see in economics of this kind of situation? You see an entrepreneur arise and produce a very high value product, carefully made, nicely packaged, advertised, often in a sort of relationship over a long period of time. And because they're a monopolist, often have that long-standing relationship, a very high price. And you're all familiar in markets like this of the Cadillac version, the fancy law firm, the prominent doctor in town, where you pay a premium, you know you're paying a lot, but you know it's going to be high quality. And in the infant foods market, you know what I'm talking about. It's Nestle's Cerelac. It's billboards that have been up since the 1960s. It has nothing to do with Similac and infant formula. We're talking about Cerelac, right? Rice or wheat or maize-based with the complementary nutrient fortification that I talked about as being necessary, and the iconic packaging that everyone knows. And in a somewhat well-to-do household, you'll see a nice row of these pots carefully planted with plants growing, because the family is quite proud that they have a dozen cans of Cerelac that they've got with plants growing in the cans. So the problem is, everybody knows you can make food of the same nutrient value, density and digestibility as Cerelac, for 1/5 or 1/4 the cost. And the reason why we know that is because donors have been doing it for 30 years. So ever since in Caparina in Central America and many other products around the world, donors have funded startups to take a local starchy staple, fortify it with local legumes and other products, and produce the same nutrient density and digestibility at 1/4 or 1/5 the cost. We know this works well in institutional settings. And when those startup entrepreneurial firms go to sell this product in the marketplace, what we know is consumers don't buy it. They don't buy it, and the economics hypothesis is because they can't see the quality. And so the economic lever here is to overcome the constraint of information between the buyer and the seller. And in the research a decade ago in Mali, we were able to do a market experiment in which a certifier, so a standard economics lever, is, of course, the price, taxes, and the issues that Olivier talked about, the ones that Richard is about to talk about, but also the institutions of governance of the market. The traffic policeman at the intersection who keeps the traffic flowing. And in this case, the quality certifier who stands between the seller and the buyer to say, you can't see what's in this sachet of infant foods, but we have inspected the plant, tested samples, and we can certify this is of high quality. What we showed in the Mali work is that the willingness to pay of even illiterate mothers, out of their desire for a better life, healthy for the children, and knowing that nutrient density and digestibility was an important issue, were willing to pay quite a lot for that information. And then in this follow-up work in Ghana, we showed that because of the lack of information, the entrepreneurs who were successful in selling in an institutional setting to the donor were unable to sell to the private sector because of this lack of information, and that a quality certification service could stand on the fulcrum of the entrepreneurs wanting to sell and the householders wanting to buy, but not having access to the information about the intrinsic quality. And by signaling that quality through quality certification, make the traffic flow much faster and have entrepreneurs sell high quality, nutrient dense and digestible infant foods from local ingredients made in lots of different ways. As we know from every culture represented in this room, people have different ways of feeding infants, and different price points, kinds of packaging. That's the market that those of us who had the luxury of growing up in an industrial society grew up with, where in the United States we have the Food and Drug Administration inspecting the plants of generic manufacturers of infant food, so we can buy the fancy Cerelac, but we can also buy the generic. That luxury is not available to people in almost all developing countries because they don't have that economic lever that makes the market, in this case, the lever of quality certification. So that's an example that I think is instructive, but there are many, many other economics levers that stand on that fulcrum of entrepreneurship, the ones Olivier talked about and Richard as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can certainly certify the time quality. Everyone is very self-regulated within 10 minutes. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Ashok. I want to talk this morning about the use of fiscal instruments in the control of diets, essentially to create incentives which work by creating the incentives to eat well and the disincentives to eat badly. The use of these instruments is becoming increasingly of interest to policymakers and is of great interest in the academic literature. For example, one recent study in the UK shows that the use of such instruments have the potential to save between 900 and 1,000 premature deaths per year. The effectiveness of these measures is a very good example of an epidemiological principle which argues that when we don't have precise means of screening and targeting our measures at the particular diseases that we're interested in other words, we have sick populations, that the measures that are best used to control these policies, these issues, are population-based measures. Purpose of my paper is not to argue against this principle, nor to argue that taxes and fiscal instruments are not useful in this process. What I want to do is to just deepen the economic analysis of these instruments a little bit. And if you push me, what I'm going to argue really is that these instruments are not really levers. They're more like a gentle breeze that sort of blows people's behavior in a particular direction. And as such, they might be rather imprecise in achieving the kinds of economic outcomes that we're interested in. When we look at these things from an economic perspective, what we tend to focus on, what we ought to focus on, are the distributional impacts of these measures. In other words, we want to know whose lives we're saving. Who are these 900,000 people's lives that we're saving with these instruments? And who is it that pays the price of the tax? Who bears the burden of the tax? The policies that we're talking about, these fiscal policies, work by affecting a marginal change in the distribution of food consumption. And their effectiveness in saving lives rests on the presumption that a large number of people's diets will be changed, and therefore a small number of lives can be changed, even if we're only able to effect marginal changes with those diets. What I want to argue is that from a social perspective, what we're interested in is not making small changes in the mean levels of consumption in the population, but what we're actually interested in are those people that have particularly bad diets, and what we want to achieve with those people are not small marginal changes in their diets. What we want to effect with those people are large and substantial changes in their diets. So the first piece of work that I want to talk about looks at the implementation of a fiscal policy. And what we do is we construct a measure which weights people's diets according to how far they are away from the recommended intakes of the nutrients that we want to control. Our measure estimates the relative risk of suffering for the disease, the average level of relative risk of suffering from a disease in a population. What it does, in common with the epidemiological literature, is it uses a logistic function to add an increasing weight, to weight increasingly the diets that are a long distance away from the mean. The policy that we simulate taxes saturated fats at the rate of 1 percentage point for every percentage point of saturated fat that there is in the food. And we also add a subsidy on fruit and vegetables in order to encourage the consumption of those goods. The figures that you see on this slide, they're a little small, you probably can't see them too clearly at the back, I'm afraid. The two columns of numbers on the right there show the relative risk, the average level of relative risk in the population relative to a situation where the whole population consumed according to the dietary recommendations. The figures on the left are the before-tax figures, and the figures on the right are the after-tax figures. And what these figures show is that the change in the number is very, very small as a result of this imposition of this tax. And the reason for that is precisely what I talked about at the outset, which is that we're not changing people's diets by very much, and there are still a very significant number of people whose diets are some considerable distance away from the mean level of consumption. Sorry, let me just go back from that slide. Okay, the second issue that I want to address is who pays the taxes. It's well known, it's an accepted economic fact, and probably wider than economics, that the proportion of people's expenditure on food decreases as their incomes increase. And therefore, it's a fact that such a policy, a tax policy on food, will be a regressive tax. If we're combining the tax with a subsidy, some politicians may claim that we're addressing that particular issue, that by using a subsidy to counter the effects of the tax, we make inroads into the regressivity of the tax. What matters, though, is the relative distribution of the taxed good and the subsidised good within the population, if that fact is to be true. So these figures show a measure which is known as the distributional characteristic of goods in an economy. The distributional characteristic measures the degree to which goods are concentrated in the socially deserving, those people who we would wish to apply a subsidy to and not to tax. The higher the number, the higher the concentration in the socially deserving. And what we see on the left there is that the very goods that we want to tax, milk, breads, eggs, the high-fat goods, are at the top of the distributional characteristic. Some way down, we see fruit and vegetables. So what we're doing with this policy, this tax subsidy policy, is that we're taxing the people that we don't want to tax, and we're subsidising the people that we don't want to subsidise. So the consequence of that policy, the combination of the subsidy and the tax, is that we actually make the tax more aggressive than we would if we just applied a simple tax. If we look at the right-hand column, what we've done there is to disaggregate the goods a little bit more, to actually look at goods which are likely to be taxed and subsidised rather than the aggregates which are on the left. And what we see there is that the position is actually even worse, because if we look at the top of that table, the highest distributional characteristic is for UHT whole milk, a good which we don't want to tax because it has a high concentration in the socially deserving, but the very good that we will tax because it has a high level of fat composition. Some way down, towards the bottom, are the semi-skimmed, the fully skimmed, and the milk that has the fat extracted from it, the goods that will have the low tax rates. So again, we see the distribution of the goods in the population amplifying the regressivity that we would observe if we just argued on the basis that the fact that food consumption is a decreasing proportion of households' expenditure in households. What we see, therefore, is what we might call a double whammy, in the words of a famous Conservative politician describing fiscal policy in the UK some time ago. What we see is a situation where we're actually not achieving the health gains in the population that we want to achieve. The health gains are being achieved with those people that don't have the particularly bad diets. And furthermore, those bad diets will tend to be consumed by poorer households. And the fiscal policy, the distributional impacts of this fiscal policy are taxing those households and redistributing the income to the richer households. I've been referring primarily to the global north, to a developed country study. This is all UK-based information. I want to just make a few remarks in the context of this conference on what might the implications of such a policy be in the global south. These conditions that we observe, these health conditions that we observe in the north, are only just beginning to appear in the global south. But as we heard this morning, the nutrition transition is one of those facts of life that will come to all countries in time. So as the nutritional transition begins to take place, the nutritional transition means that we see growing incomes and diets of the urban populations moving towards those sorts of diets that lead to the adverse health implications that we're trying to tax. The rural poor probably stay with the conventional traditional diets of the country in question, but those rural poor will also bear a burden of the tax because they are the producers of the food which we're taxing as a consequence of this policy. So in this context, the double whammy becomes a triple whammy. And then finally, I want to just refer to some likely unintended consequences of the sort of policy that we're talking about. First of all foods have some nutritional good. Even high-fat milk, even high-fat meat diets have some nutritional quality. If we put a tax on those goods, what we will see is not only a reduction in the bad parts of the diet that are contributed by those goods, but we will also see a reduction in the good parts of the diet, the nutritionally good parts of the diet. And in particular, what we see with the policy that I've just been describing to you, because it has a major impact on the consumption of dairy products, is a reduction in the consumption of vitamin D and calcium as a reduction of this policy. And then finally, the final unintended consequence is the unintended consequence for producers. There are likely to be land use and farming consequences of this policy. Not all land is suitable for the production of the type of goods that we're encouraging people to consume. Nor are all farmers capable or skilled enough or skilled in the methods that are needed to produce these products. And in a very crude way, what we've done again in a UK context is to simulate the impacts of everybody in the UK switching entirely to the dietary recommendations that are recommended in the UK. An unrealistic scenario, but what we show with that scenario is that almost all upland agriculture disappears in the UK if that takes place. And that is likely to be a consequence. Those types of consequences are likely to be observed everywhere that such a policy takes place. I can't remember how many whammies we're up to now, but I think you get the picture about the policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.